Welcome, champions, to the next overview and tier list ranking, featuring the newest champion. This is where we'll break down their mechanics and place them in my overall tier list for every champion in the game. So let's talk about Solaak, the neutral good Kalashtar Ranger in Seat 2. He serves the group solely as a support, so let's see what that looks like. He slots in your formation a bit different than the average champion, having his Lil Drake Levitts take his spot in the formation to represent his slot while he flies on Da Big Drake Tempest in the back. This doesn't really mean anything for how he works, it's simply cosmetic. His first formation ability is Compatriots, where he gains a stack of reach for each champion with a ranged primary attack in the formation. Each one of these reach stacks increases the damage of those champions, stacking multiplicatively. That's right, only ranged. Who are DPS that are ranged, you might ask? Catti-brie and Zorbu, two champions. Full stop, the end. I don't know what to say. That's the most restrictive I've seen a single formation ability other than something that affects a specific affiliation or something like that. I don't know how to feel about it. On one hand, he's pretty good for those two. I mean, think of him as the Ulcoria for ranged attackers. I just feel like that restricts him too much. There's no option to make him a viable buffer for anyone else in the game. It just feels very strange to have a new champion be useful for only two champions, where it isn't even because they share an affiliation or something. At least with Ulcoria and magic users, there are 11 DPS options. But let's move on to the rest of his kit. He also gets maneuvers, which is a strange choice of terminology for a ranger, but it increases the effect of compatriots each time an enemy is knocked back, stacking multiplicatively to a max of 50 stacks, resetting when you change areas. The reset here isn't too bad, as it only requires a knockback and not a kill or something of that nature. And you can make Solaak himself an excellent source of knocking enemies back. For another hearty oomph, he also gets critical mass, increasing the effect of outgoing positional formation abilities of all champions with a ranged base attack for each reach stack he has, stacking additively. It is a fairly limited list of what abilities this affects, so let me wrap that off real quick. Remember here, we're taking a look at positional formation abilities coming from champions with a ranged primary attack. Deacon's Story of Doom. Spurt's Centipede Net, although there is some clunk here, as if Spurt is in his spirit form, which you generally want him to be, he no longer has an attack, so he will no longer be classified as ranged. And that means he will not count for compatriots or be buffed by critical mass when, quote, dead. Polton's Magical Secrets, Desmond's Noble Heart, Shandy's Agile Allies, Catti-brie's Death March, Egbert's Atone for the Past, who also knocks enemies back to synergize with maneuvers as well, Human's Teamwork when Yasa is active, Morgaine's Paid Up Front, Nordom's Form Orderly Ranks, Imoen's Optimism, and finally Zorbu's Hunter's Pack. And to bring it all together, he also has Blitzing Barrage, where every time a champion with a ranged attack attacks, there is a 5% chance per stack of reach that their base attack cooldown is instantly reset. So the idea is not only to have your DPS be ranged, but to stack everything up, you also need to use ranged supports, which are also fairly limited, and pairing them together is very unoptimized, as most of them are not the greatest buffers themselves or reliant on other champions to make them viable. For example, if you want to use Viconia, she only buffs Evil, Neutral, or Baldur's Gate, depending on what specializations you take. Catti and Zorbu are none of those things, but you can make them count as neutral with Corazon, but he doesn't have a ranged attack. So not only are you relying on the lower buffing power of both Viconia and Corazon, but you're also down one ranged in your formation. Or let's talk about Desmond, who is very strong in the right situation, but we cannot make that situation happen. He requires the champions that can be counted as dead, like Spurt, who is ranged, but as we went over, while he is dead, he does not count as ranged. But then there are also Blushi and Veronica. Veronica does not have a ranged attack, and not only does Blushi not have a ranged attack, she also shares a seat with Solaak, so she can't even be used if you wanted to. His specialization choice is between Unwavering, which makes his base attack speed reduced by 2 seconds, which also increases his maneuvers to 30% per stack, making his knockbacks and damage increase more reliable. This will more often than not be your pick. Emboldened makes his primary attack deal damage in an AoE, and debuff the enemies he hits to take 400% more damage for 5 seconds. Unfortunately, there is no way to increase this buff's power, and while it's now an AoE, it still only knocks back one target. And with Confident, he now makes each formation slot occupied by an escort at 1 reach stack for Compatriots. His ultimate has him fly across the battlefield on Tempest, dealing damage, knocking back, and stunning all enemies in his path. So let's talk about the event he's tied to, Fleetswake. This year we have Solaak, Desmond, and Oriza. If you are looking for a hard focus, Desmond is likely your best bet. He fits in many formations well and has unique synergies, as well as being incredibly useful for variants that restrict slots in your formation with escorts or objects. It's a toss-up between Oriza or Solaak though. Oriza being a mid-low DPS, and support only really being viable with Artemis as she's a positional DPS. But she's currently overshadowed by Nova in her seat. As always, if you have the means, you should be full epicking who you can. But unless you're hard focusing Catti or Zorb as your main DPS for Solaak, Desmond's the star this time around. Though do keep in mind, it is Oriza's last year before she is retired and only obtainable through time gates. Now what about Solaak's achievement and adventure variants? His achievement isn't too bad, requiring you to scale up his maneuvers. This is honestly likely to happen just as you play, simply requiring 2,500 stacks of maneuvers throughout your playtime with him. Doesn't have to be a single zone, in one adventure, just in general. It's honestly one of the hardest achievements ever because it requires you to use him. LOL. His first variant is as simple as his achievement for the most part, introducing you to his unique placement between himself, Tempest, and Levitz, requiring him to be slotted in your formation, able to be moved but not removed. You are hit with a Dex 13 or higher limitation for other champions being slotted, but that's like 80% of the roster. In the second variant, he again can be moved but not removed. But this time the attack cooldown of anyone without a ranged attack is increased by 10 seconds, reinforcing that you want to be using people with ranged attacks. While literally none of the core champions of the game have a ranged attack, even beginners shouldn't struggle with this one regardless. An annoyance more than anything if you don't have some ranged. As should be expected, the third forces him in your formation again, still allowed to be moved but not removed. This time, however, a bronze dragon takes up 3 of your formation slots. This encourages you to take the specialization to counter this. If you struggle with this one at all, also remember that Desmond is a part of this event, and his Lament the Lost will give a large damage buff for those 3 slots being taken up. Honestly, this one also shouldn't halt just about any player from progressing. Now, while he's very restrictive by nature, his actual availability is really good, being available for every patron, and day 1 trials of Tiamat restriction. But on the same hand, that only matters if you're using Catti or Zorbu as your DPS. For where he falls in my tier list, it's going to be a little confusing. Because remember, I rank champions based on where I feel they fit within the overall utility of the game. With that in mind, I'm placing him in a low C, evading the D tier because his numbers are actually good, and one of the 2 DPS he is used for, Zorbu, is actually a good DPS. But with that being said, just know that if you are specifically using Catti or Zorbu as your DPS, his kit is more in the high A range for them. But the larger problem as a whole is if you aren't using one of them too, he's a complete dud. But even if you are, he's competing in Seat 2 with Krydle, one of the better tanks now, and Blushi, a decent tank and powerful damage buffer. But simply the fact he only buffs ranged really limits him. At the end of the day, do I consider him a bad champion? No, I don't. I just think there isn't enough in the game to make use of his talents. And they went out of their way to make sure he was very restrictive. I have no problem with very specialized champions like this existing. I would have preferred his specializations to be a choice between, maybe an option of increased Compatriots buff, then the second choice of switching the range to be melee, and then the third being a choice to switch the range to magic, so he could be more viable. But maybe one day we'll have plenty of ranged DPS options and he'll be great for all of them. Maybe. I'm glad you spent your time here with me today. I'd love it if you knocked back that sub, like, and bell. Leave a comment on what you think of Solaak. And always remember, have a hell of a time out there, champions.